UCL. She recently authored a book called Smoke and Mirrors: How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. And her talk will be primarily based on this topic. Interestingly, Gemma will not use any slides, which is really good. Gemma will speak about 30-40 minutes, and then I'll open the floor for questions. But in the meantime, if you have any burning questions or clarifications, please write it in the chat, and I'll try to interrupt Gemma if that's possible. Okay, Gemma, floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming again.
Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you for the invite, and thank you, Matthew, as well for connecting us up. That was really good of you. And yes, I think it's a year now of all these Zoom meetings and whatnot. I'm actually not a massive fan of watching slides on my screen, so I try and avoid doing it myself. So hopefully that works for you lot. I'll probably talk for about 20-30 minutes. Not very good at time myself, so hopefully it'll only be that long, and we can get into some discussion. I find discussion with these sort of topics tends to be the most fruitful and useful and interesting. Hopefully for you guys it certainly is for me as well, so we'll see how it goes. But before I kind of get into talking a bit about some of the themes of the book and some of the work I've been looking at, I thought I would give you a little bit of context as to how I kind of came to this topic and why I wanted to write about it. Because hype, I guess, as a concept has, I guess, been part of my career in many different roles that I've had over the years. After doing my I'm very big on the screen now. I'm going to personally put back to gallery because my face just suddenly came up. Cool. I hope that's okay. After my undergrad, I did maths up at St Andrews. I ended up, as many maths grads do, in investment banking. And I was specifically in the team that looks after IPOs at JP Morgan, the equity capital markets team. So, of course, I was thinking a lot about roadshows and selling and kind of how it is you position companies in particular ways. Of course, at the time, I was very much focused on being an Excel monkey and putting numbers into PowerPoint slides for my superiors. But I was very interested in this idea of roadshows and selling and convincing people. Didn't last long in investment banking, decided that wasn't for me. And then I ended up in advertising, which of course is a whole industry dedicated to convincing and hyping and persuasion and thinking deeply about how you try to get ideas across and people to agree with you, disagree with you or whatever, or come on board with what it is that you have to say. After my role, I was just in kind of account management in advertising, but I ended up in a corporate innovation team at Ogilvy and Mather. And so my job was essentially to go and meet startups, various different kind of industry partners, write reports about the future of X for the benefit of all the different clients of Ogilvy around the world. And here, I guess, was where I started thinking a little bit, shall we say, a bit more critically about what it is, what role hype plays within industry, within media, and within, I guess, being the sort of undercurrent or a force or whatever you want to call it, invisible hand, some people say, in terms of how things come to be. I also was thinking about it in the sense of, I was in an innovation team, and I'm sure a lot of you will have come across this phenomenon, considering the sort of department a lot of you are associated with, where innovation has become less of a doing word and a kind of focused in R&D, but a lot of a kind of marketing word. So companies are very keen to say that they're innovative and to show that they're innovative, but not necessarily to be innovative. And so a lot of the time the work that came to me was like, hey, Gemma, we have this client, they want to look innovative. So can you think of something they could do that would make them look innovative? This drove me up the wall. I hated these briefs coming on my desk, but it made me really think about, well, what is it? Why is it that this idea of innovation has such currency and value? And why is it that, brands that are looking to advertise are specifically at the moment wanting to kind of give off that feel and kind of jump on the bandwagon, shall we say, of innovation speak. And then after that, I became a journalist. And of course, you're spending a lot of time, because I wrote specifically about startups, tech startups, you're spending a lot of time receiving pitches from companies trying to get you to write about them. You're going to conferences and hearing people get on stage and say wonderful things about whatever it is that they do and try and get you to agree with them or believe in them, or, you know, do things like this where you're trying to put your ideas out and hopefully people think you're interesting. And so I guess I was spending a lot of time being hyped at, shall we say, and having to try and navigate what narratives were being put in front of me were the most true, were the most interesting, were worth me then replicating and further hyping or giving platform to by then writing articles about these different companies. So I guess for me, the point at which I wanted to write this book, it started off from this place of frustration of going, oh, there's so much around science and technology that's not fully understood. There's a lot of narratives out there that don't feel right. You know, I'm going to a dinner party or I'm going to see relatives and they're going, oh, you work in science and tech. What do you think about the robots, you know, going to take over the world? What do you think about that? You must be an expert. And I think I was like, it's great that people are engaging with these ideas, but at the same time, I thought it was problematic that the same sort of ideas were being repeated over and over again without this sort of depth of understanding. So when I first started thinking about writing this book, it was coming from this space of, how do I bust the hype? How do I take all these different areas of science and tech and say what's really going on? But as I started looking into the topic a little bit deeper and realizing that actually hype, first of all, is quite difficult to define. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about where I kind of landed on in terms of trying to define it myself. People have very different kind of emotional reactions to the idea of hype. Some people think it's this really annoying thing that gets in the way. Particularly academics or people who are super technical, they don't like that hype is used, whereas people like investors or advertisers obviously know that it's this tool that's absolutely crucial, and you know, if you're not hyping doesn't mean you don't care about what it is that you do, and actually says a lot about you as an entrepreneur or whatnot if you're making the effort to hype. And then of course there are more sort of public cultural perspective, and when you think about, you know, new fashion launches or new music or whatnot, hype is a good thing as well. So it's got this interesting kind of dynamic, and again, the reality of the fact that it exists. It's not necessarily a thing that we just need to bust, but rather something we need to look at as a force in and of itself. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with Smoke and Mirrors, and what I've been interested in doing over the past couple of years. So oh, and just to briefly kind of a little addendum, now my research at UCL, as Abdullah mentioned, I'm doing a PhD there now, and it's all around looking at basically what does it mean to be an ethical futurist, so particularly corporate futurists. So that kind of came from this question of, what does it mean to responsibly hype? What does it mean to think about your ideas that you're putting out into the world? How do you advise about the future in a particular way without knowing that what you say has an impact, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what I'm trying to wrestle with somehow. I'm only in the first year, so I'm sure you guys will know more than anyone else that PhDs at this time change a lot. So who knows what it'll be at the end, but that's what we're starting with. Okay, so what is hype? If you look at it in the dictionary, you'll obviously find things like exaggerated publicity, or just publicity. It's interesting. I think it's Oxford say it's exaggerated and Cambridge just say publicity. So not everybody has this idea that it's untrue or over the top or whatever. Sometimes it's just this idea of it being taking a message and making it more well known, shall we say. But the reason I called the book Smoke and Mirrors is I think about hype through the context of an analogy to magic. So if you think about if you go to a magic show and you walk in the doors and you know you're going to a magic show, you've not accidentally walked into a magic show. You're very aware of the fact that you're going to a magic show, and you're sitting in the audience and you're effectively consenting to be fooled. You're saying to the magician, by sitting there in that room, it's okay for you to try to fool me. I might sit here and just enjoy being fooled, or I might sit here and try and work out what it is that you're doing. But ultimately, the fact that I'm here and I'm engaging, it's okay for you to try and fool me. That is consensual. Lying is non-consensual fooling, if you were to kind of use that same analogy. What I think happens with hype is a tool that is used that sometimes can result in accidental fooling. So there's a difference between misinformation, disinformation, fake news, which is like a very deliberate, this is a message that I know to be wrong that I'm putting out into the world. Whereas hype is a message that you're putting out that when it is snowballed in a particular way, when it's taken out of context, crucially, when it's repeated in certain ways without other pieces of information, it can result in accidental fooling on the part of the person who receives it. So I kind of make the point to separate lying and hype. You know, people always ask me at these events, you know, what do you think of Theranos? And I'm like, well, that wasn't hype. I mean, they were lying. You know, they were hyping up their lie, perhaps, but it was a lie. So there is allegedly. I wrote an article about Theranos, and my editor said I had to put allegedly because the case hadn't gone through the court. And I was like, I think we all know that we don't need to say allegedly anymore. But anyway, so I really do think there's a big difference between those forces, and specifically something interesting about this idea of a message that has a grain of truth, that it comes from a space of wanting to get a truthful message out into the world for a particular purpose, but can result in misunderstanding or exaggeration that then turns into a falsity in the mind of the receiver. The thing I kind of keep coming back to as well about hype is that and it sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but I feel that it's helpful to repeat it. Hype is very much a tool for grabbing attention. It's not about understanding. It's not about trying to get a message out into the world and get people to really, you know, take that message to heart and understand it and get what you're talking about. No, it's just to get someone to stop scrolling, to click on something, to think that you're interesting, to maybe hopefully go do a bit more work and think about something a bit deeper. But it really is just that capturing attention tool. And when you put it into the context of like a marketing toolkit, it's kind of obvious that it's simply there for that attention grabbing moment. And this is, I guess, where I think the issues with hype, when we talk about practitioners and people who are putting hype out into the world in many different ways, we have to have a bit of a reckoning, right? So, and there's two elements of this. We have to understand that hype is this powerful force. It's a reality of the world that we live in, whether you're, you know, an academic trying to get funding, whether you're a startup founder trying to get a VC to believe in you, whether you're, I don't know, someone in government trying to put through policy. This is a tool that you will most likely, if you're, you know, strategic, use at some point in order to capture some kind of attention. But without, you know, a focus on the receivers of that hype, going beyond the hype and not thinking about the fact that it's purely there for attention, that's one way that things can go wrong. But the other side that I think is also quite interesting, which hopefully we can touch on a little bit more, some of my examples hopefully we'll touch on as well, is a bit of a reckoning that we secretly, not so secretly, like hype. We kind of hate it, don't hate it, a lot of people who think about it deeply, in the sense that you're like, you see a message and you think, oh, that's so hyped up, or that's ridiculous, you know, AIs are going to steal our jobs, whatever. That feels not quite right. But at the same time, if you're working in the AI space and you desperately need somebody to understand what you're talking about quickly, you know that this is a powerful tool for getting attention. So we also have to have a reckoning of our sort of complicity around hyped up messages for those of us who work specifically in areas like science and technology, who have the understanding of these hype dynamics already. And this is kind of where I guess the question around what does it mean to responsibly hype come in, because again, it is just a reality of the world that we live in. So how do we do it in such a way that we're accepting this force, this thing, and using it in such a way that makes sense. So I thought I would just briefly go through 3 of the examples I have in the book. For anyone who hasn't heard of the book or whatever, it's got 9 chapters, and each chapter is focused on a different area of science and technology. So, you know, there's a fusion energy chapter, there's a quantum computing chapter, cancer therapeutics, commercialization of space, farming. So all different ones. And the idea is I kind of show what the main narratives are, and then why they exist, what the sort of dynamics of those narratives are, and then sort of show the system underlying those narratives, and basically kind of give people the tools to try and explore those systems and therefore get beyond the narrative that sits at the top. So I thought I would just briefly give you 3 examples from the book, and then we can talk a little bit about what my sort of definition or ideas are around responsible hyping. Hopefully the examples will kind of pull out some of the conflicts and contradictions. Oh, did somebody say something there? Oh, no, okay. I thought someone might have had a question, but just shout if you do. Okay, so the first example I thought I would do is AI, because that's kind of the one people go to the most when you think about hyped up technologies. So the narrative that I chose to kind of look at with respect to AI is this: robots are going to steal our jobs. And really what I mean by that narrative is not just the words and the idea that there's a robot coming in and stealing jobs, but rather this idea of otherness and this idea of it being something that is out of our human control, something that's happening to us, which is really what that narrative actually evokes. If you think about, robots are stealing our job, it's this thing of robots being this thing. It's a similar narrative that's been used to talk about immigrants over the years, this idea of coming in and taking power away, taking money away, dislodging. But it's also a sort of shift in responsibility around a kind of deeper discussion. Of course, in this case, it's around monetary power, jobs, employment, and so on and so forth. So if you take the narrative, robots are going to steal your job, and you think, really what we're talking about here is automation, it's very easy to very quickly change that narrative to something like corporate executives are making active decisions to replace human labor with automated machines in the name of profit, right? I mean, you're saying the same thing, arguably, about automation, about the dynamics of what's happening, but you're saying something completely different. And what you're evoking with those words is something entirely different. And of course, words matter, the pen is mightier than the sword, of course. But when you start looking at these two headlines, it's pretty obvious which one is going to be chosen by a newspaper, both because one is very wordy and annoying, but the other has this, if it bleeds, it leads. It's got a much more interesting approach to talking about these things. It's much easier to understand from a sort of cultural perspective when you think about movies and the way AI has been depicted over the years in popular context. But really where I kind of see the issue with this narrative, with this hype, is that not only are you evoking this, I guess, this feeling of it's not anyone's fault, it's this machine's fault, and we don't have, it's happening to us as humans. It's so disempowering, and it's also just completely untrue. If you really think about this idea of control, it's completely untrue. I mean, as I'm sure probably most of you know who work in any kind of anything to do with AI, any business or startup or whatever, lots of decisions are made by the people who build the technology, whether it's the data sets that are used, the specific algorithms that are chosen, the specific models, whether or not it's actually employed, whether or not we actually turn the thing on or turn it off, who you sell it to, how much you charge for it. There's so many different elements of choice and deliberateness and so on and so forth. So this kind of narrative of, the AI is coming, whilst it can also be shifted to be a more positive thing, AI is going to save the world or whatever, it still has this lack of control, kind of othering element to it, which takes away responsibility. And where I find that problematic is because you're essentially diverting conversation away from deeper discussion around agency and around people's involvement who are not the ones building it. So the argument that I kind of make in that chapter is that this narrative has an element of truth. This is a thing that's accelerating. The technology is moving quickly. Jobs are being replaced through schemes of automation, and we are able to do really powerful things with this technology. But as we keep using these similar kind of othering and power-based narratives that shift the focus, we're essentially disempowering the populace from being able to engage in what is realistically actually a very engageable technology and area of development. So that's the kind of one example of where I think hyped up narratives are problematic from that perspective of masking or diverting or blinkering the populace. Another example that I have in the book is around fusion. And I guess this is the chapter that shows the problem when things are underhyped to some degree, or have been overhyped in the past, and now there's a sort of diminishment of trust or focus. So the sort of story of the development of fusion is absolutely fascinating. It starts with a whole load of actual fraud in Argentina with this arguably mad scientist who claimed that he could do fusion and but was not. It was building loads. We got a load of money from the Argentinian government and wasn't doing what he said he was doing. And that fraud got exposed. It got talked about in the international press. And then that story actually inspired scientists who actually were working on these technologies to move things forward in a different way. So it gave them ideas. And so that was sort of in the 40s and 50s. And over time, what's happened with fusion technologies, of course, there's been these moments where machines have been built and they've turned on. And there's been a lot of excitement and press and build up around this turning on moment. And it's we're going to be able to, only use fusion and we'll have unlimited energy and all these kind of ideas that come with that. And then when the machine has turned on, normally the machine is actually done very good things from a scientific perspective. It's worked in the sense that it was meant to, but because it has not suddenly created unlimited energy, it's seen as a massive failure, and fusion ends up being the butt of a joke in terms of scientific development. It also suffers from being, unfortunately, confusing for a lot of people. People confuse fission with fusion. So fission is what we have in current nuclear reactors. Fusion is what happens in the sun and is what a lot of development is happening at the moment to try and kind of take off our reliance on fossil fuels. And also there is a big, which is kind of having a bit of resurgence at the moment, unfortunately, a lot of pseudoscience around the idea of cold fusion. So can we do fusion at room temperature? Which unfortunately a lot of prominent scientists got behind in the past and then was exposed as pseudoscience. So it gets tied with this joke element. But the reality of kind of fusion development at the moment, for anyone who kind of follows the field, is that there's, the biggest science experiment on the planet is happening in the south of France right now. It's called ITER, ITER, where it's an huge international collaboration to try and get fusion to work. But nobody knows about it. And I think what's interesting here is on one side you could say, well, we should let the scientists get on with it and not have any involvement, because there's been this sort of disappointing continued demonization by the press and by the public about wasting money. But at the same time, there's been a lot of issues around choices around investment in fusion, because actually there's not been as much scrutiny. So there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of projects have been shut down, and there's also a bit of a focus on one main kind of fusion and magnetic confinement, as opposed to ignition or others, which essentially means that we're sort of putting a lot of eggs in one basket as opposed to diversifying the ways that we approach fusion as a development. So, it's an interesting, I guess, way of looking at hype and thinking, well, it's created this joke in the populace. It's a thing that politicians tend not to really want to talk about, because the public either don't get it, or if they have heard about it, they see it's a waste of money, and so it's not popular to talk about it. But then at the same time, there's a lot of money and a lot of focus going into this technology, which arguably is quite exciting in terms of energy development. What's worrying for me is that ITER is turning on in 2025, and so you can see, I don't know if you've noticed, there's been a little bit more coverage about fusion in the press over the last year or two, and it's because there's now a build up to this turning on moment. And there's a question of, if ITER doesn't do as they're hoping it will, is that the end of development of fusion in terms of public buy-in? So interesting kind of case study there. And the third one I want to quickly touch on, which I think pulls in this idea of the placebo effect that hype can have, is around quantum computing. So if anybody has followed the world of quantum computing, there's one company in particular, which is called D-Wave, which is now, I guess, the poster boy of hype and bad hype in the world of quantum computing. They essentially kept sort of claiming that they were creating these quantum computers with hundreds and then thousands of qubits. They got tons and tons of investment as a result. from NASA, from various different companies, Rolls-Royce, from a whole load of cyber companies. And it turns out that they don't actually use qubits, they use a thing called quantum annealers, and it massively reduces what the sort of capability of the quantum computer is. And they kind of got exposed a couple of years ago as doing this. Now, what's interesting is they didn't really lie at any point. They just didn't tell the full truth. And so for some people, that is cardinal sin. This company shouldn't have been saying all these things. But at the same time, what's happened is they massively helped push interest in quantum computing as a corporate interest massively up the food chain, which has been very, very useful in terms of getting more investment into the field, and specifically more investment into basic research, which is something that, you know, in years gone by has not necessarily been as successful at getting investment into. So there's this kind of open question around, is hype justified if you're sort of, do the ends justify the means? You know, is more general interest in quantum computing worthy of one company essentially being pretty shady in their comms in order to push investment and interest up for their own benefit, when actually it's benefited the whole? And you could argue that because D-Wave got so much investment, they actually have now created computers, which is debatable, but arguably do have some value, specifically in the world of machine learning, that they didn't have when they were getting the funding, but that they were claiming they could. So there's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of hype, and you know, I think it's similar to the placebo effect in the sense of, you know, ethically, how do you feel about doctors giving out placebos? How do you feel about them lying to patients for the patients to feel better? Or should we not have doctors ever lying about what they're giving to patients, but then losing that placebo effect that we know does exist? And it's a similar sort of question with hype. So I'm just going to briefly touch on then this idea of responsible hype, and hopefully from those three examples, perhaps it comes across that hype it's a sort of double-edged sword. It's not necessarily something that is universally bad, but at the same time, when not sort of handled carefully, it can have effects which aren't so great. Unfortunately, it's also a really difficult thing to control. So when I say handled, you know, once you put something out into the world, you're not really handling it anymore. So again, it's about being conscious of this force, shall we say. So when I think about responsible hype, it really comes back to intention, right? It's like, what is it that you're hyping in the first place? Is the thing that you're putting out into the world, this message or this ask or this claim or this proposal or whatever that might be, is it worth it? And of course, you're going to then get questions around, what do we all agree is good? What do we all agree is valuable? Is this particular research useful? Is this particular company worthy of existing? You know, some people would say that an Instagram for hamsters is a great thing for entertainment purposes, and other people would say, no, we don't bloody need an Instagram for hamsters, for crying out loud. We've got enough social media platforms, right? So there's arguments made in both ways, but I think there's actually not enough thought gone into this idea of, do we actually need to be hyping this? And I see this most prevalently in the sort of startup space, where, you know, I'll have companies come to me and say, hey, can you help me with my PR? You're a journalist, you're good at, you know, understanding how to get things in, you know, I want to get my startup in Wired, or I want to get a startup in TechCrunch or whatever. And my question is always like, why? You know, are you trying to hire at the moment? Are you trying to get investment? Are you trying to sell a product? Like, what is it about the audience of TechCrunch or Wired that's actually useful for you? Or do you just want to put that logo in your investor deck? Or do you just want fame or ego or so on and so forth? There's a lot more to hype than just being able to grab attention, right? It's sexy to be in the press and so on and so forth. So we really have to be, you know, knowing that this is a powerful force, instead of just being like, well, it's a reality of the world, we have to market ourselves, so on and so forth. It's going, well, actually, this force can really sway public involvement, public opinion. And if you're adding to a sort of existing imaginary, shall we say, that is irresponsible, right? So having those kind of questions around ego, need, want is really, really important. The two things that I kind of think about for companies in particular, when they say to me, you know, how do I responsibly hype? The first one I say is tell system stories as opposed to problem solution stories, which is obviously very common, and particularly in the kind of pitch environment. So this is a problem with the world, and look at us, we have this solution, this is how it works, and this is how much money we want you to invest in us. I feel that nowadays it's not enough, particularly in areas like deep tech, to position your product against, or your solution against, one problem. As we know, the world is far more interconnected than that, and there's much more hunger for system stories. And so if I'm listening to a pitch, or I get an email with a PR, with a press release, whatever, if they're not acknowledging this much more global system, as much more interconnected system, and the kind of effects of what their solution does beyond just solving this one problem, to me, that's kind of reeks of hype and a kind of lack of understanding of how stories are told, but also how pertinent this kind of, I think it feels not very well thought of, and not very of the moment, particularly the last year, considering, I used to always try and convince people that systems journalism and systems thinking was really important. And then coronavirus came, and you almost don't really need to convince people anymore. As we know, the toilet rolls in the supermarket are not there because of supply chain, and so on and so forth. And suddenly conversations about systems is far more obvious in the public realm. So that's one thing. And the other thing is around making a clear distinction between reality and vision. And I think this is something that's quite difficult, particularly for people in business, because you're sort of taught to, put your mission first, your vision first, what is the sort of picture of what it is that you're trying to achieve. But the problem here is that you can very easily fall into the trap of not actually sort of declaring the reality of how you make money. So example would be, for instance, a company that I was looking into a while back, who is a satellite company, and they essentially wanted to provide internet for the unconnected, and that was their whole thing, connect the unconnected, and so on and so forth. But it's an expensive thing to do if you want to make it cheap eventually. And of course, if it's about providing internet in places that don't currently have it, you're talking about having to make that product, not selling it at the price that you're necessarily making it. So there was a lot of innovation, development, R&D that had to be done in order to get it to the point that they'd be able to sell into those markets. So in the meantime, they were providing internet services for military and for oil companies who were shipping and in sort of hard to reach areas and needing that connection. So of course it's, some journalists would see that as a sort of gotcha moment, it's like, oh, well, that's actually what you're doing. You're not doing this other thing, instead of giving that sort of nuance and that context of like, well, in order to get here, we're doing this, and telling that story up front and being clear about what is the reality of right now versus the vision of what we're doing, and letting people decide for themselves what they think about that story, as opposed to only putting out that vision and essentially hiding what you actually do for a living and what that business model is. It doesn't really fly as much anymore. One final thing that I just always like to mention as well is, I think the idea that technology and science in particular, but even business, is sort of separate and objective. I mean, this is obviously a big thing that's discussed a lot in science studies, this idea of science being this objective thing. In academia, these ideas don't hold any water, really, as it's been, looked at for years and years and years, but they have had prominence in broader media and in the public. I think that's starting to shift, this idea of science being an objective thing, that tech is just tech. It's, has no, tech is not good or bad, it's just neutral. That's not really true. And it's being talked about a lot more in the public realm. And of course, criticisms of the role of business and so on and so forth is more and more every day, as you all know. So with that, using hype and utilizing that tool for attention has to be more nuanced in order for those messages to sit right within, I guess, a feeling of not having this separate objective kind of, we're just trying to do this thing. Interconnectedness in systems are far more obvious nowadays. So really that's the case to be made for being responsible at hype. It's not just about doing good, it's about actually your message making sense in the environment and the society that we live in today. So I'm gonna stop at that. Hopefully that planted some seeds and hopefully can spur some discussion. I'd love to hear your questions or your comments. Feel free to agree, disagree. I always think this is a good time to just hear what everybody thinks about some of these topics, because it's not a simple answer, as I found researching this topic for 2 years. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Gemma. That's a kind of a very powerful tour de force almost of the concept. Thank you very much. It's mind-blowing. Let's start with Matt. Matt has a question.
Hello, Gemma. Welcome. Many thanks for coming along today. That was really interesting. I must confess, I haven't quite finished your book, but I am halfway through it and enjoying it. So I look forward to finishing that. Yeah, so I guess just a couple of quick comments and then a fairly kind of probably annoyingly broad question. But the first is just, I guess, a difference in maybe how I would define this. And I thought your stance on how you would define hype was interesting. And I think if I can parrot back, maybe wrongly about what you were defining it as, is it was storytelling to generate interest in a technology. I think for me, I often frame hype, and maybe wrongly myself, in a some more negative way. It's the overinflation of expectation about future promise. And I think you moved on to that. I think what was interesting, the way you framed it, was that it was this storytelling about the technology's promise, but that can then kind of spiral out of control. And I really enjoyed that point. And I think I've seen that a lot. The technologies I've encountered, and your positioning of the media was really interesting. I also, just final comment, is just interesting to understand whether it will lead on to my question, whether we need hype for companies to get over the line. But do they need to hype to draw that investment in and to gain legitimacy for their product or service? So my question is, I guess, linked to that, why do we need hype? Like, do we need hype? Is it something that is necessary, or could we just do away with the term, put it in the bin, and call it a PR exercise or marketing? So anyway, thank you. Really enjoyed that.
That's awesome. Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, this is actually why a lot of my talks I end up talking about responsible hype, because if you just criticize hype, you're only going to get people saying, yeah, but we need it. So how do we do it properly? We're not going to not use it because we need attention. And that's kind of why I have both this sort of magic analogy, but then I also talk about it as a tool for capturing attention. And I mean, this term attention economy kind of gets thrown around quite a lot. There's obviously a lot of work on what that really means. I think in terms of, do we need it versus do we need marketing? You could argue that they are one and the same in some ways. I think that hype is a form of marketing, in the same way that, making a documentary about a company is a form of marketing, so it's a tool, right? And it's a tool about putting out a narrative that you hope is going to, is so simplistic and so kind of evocative from an emotional perspective of some kind, that it's going to stop people in tracks and get them to kind of want to know more, to listen, or to believe, or whatever, and then hopefully also propagate. So yes, it is. You could argue we could get rid of the term. I think that it's a useful term, though, in the sense of talking, as you said, about this idea of overinflation of expectation, which again is not lying, because it's what we hope to happen, or what the people putting the message out hope to happen.
So there's an important caveat to that, is benchmarking that overinflation of expectation against of future promise against what we currently know.
No, exactly.
And that's where, that the devil is in that detail.
But the point I think is, the people you tend to be targeting with hype don't know. So they don't have anything to kind of judge, right? And also, people putting out hype are not necessarily doing it to try and trick, right? It's more about going, we believe, we expect this to happen, and we have our data or our reasons or whatever for thinking that this will happen, and so we're going to say this thing. I think, again, if you're doing it in a way that is against what you think, then that you're lying. You see what I mean? So I think that's kind of where I see the difference. To come back to your point around, do companies need it to get over the line? I think that companies need attention. You need to be able to get into the room, whether it's with the investor, whether it's with the policymaker, whether it's in front of consumers, whatever it is. You need people to know you exist, and you need people to understand what your selling point is, and blah, 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 blah. I think that depending on what it is that you're doing, hype sometimes is needed and other times is not. And that's where I kind of come back to this idea of why are you even doing it? So if a company's like, oh, we want to try and get investment for our biotech product, from these 4 investors that are experts in this space, I'd be going, why on earth are you trying to get a feature in Wired based on biotech is going to save the world? You don't need that. You don't need that to do the thing that you want to do. What you need is an introduction, or you need a really good deck, or you need to show up at their offices, or you need to, unfortunately put a sort of representation of yourself as an individual that's going to get yourself in that room. So that's where I think the difference is. It's thinking about what are you using that tool specifically for, and when are you using it. If you're trying to get a law passed, then you're going to need a more broad populace to care about stuff, or you don't. Maybe you just need to know the people who are writing the policies in the first place. So I think that's where, and I think I mentioned it actually briefly, though I probably didn't go into much detail. That's why I think context is really the point, right? Hype is detrimental when it's taken out of context. If you put a message out that's meant for someone who's knowing, and they're kind of like, yeah, okay, fine, we know AI is going to do great things, right? Tell me more. Whereas if you put it in front of someone who doesn't already have that context, they're like, wow, AI is going to do these amazing things. So I've just read this thing. That's oversimplistic. But I guess the point is that context is where things start getting muddy, which again comes back to this point of, do you need it and why? Hopefully that answers, or at least touches on some of the points you raised.
Gemma, I think you created a hype yourself. There are lots of questions.
Good.
So,
it was funny thinking about how to get this book, people to buy this book. I was so conscious of like overhyping my book.
What I propose is that there are lots of questions. Maybe we take all of them.
Yeah.
And you try to answer them. So
these are the ones in the chat. Is that right?
I will kind of outline them. So let's start with David and Status. And there's a chat one I will read after Status asks his question, and Sarah asks in chat as well. I will outline it as well. And I have a question myself. So there are 6 questions.
Okay.
David.
Yeah, thanks, Abdullah, and thank you, Gemma. That was really thought-provoking. So I've come across hype in large form in 2 previous lives. The first was in terms of civil-military cooperation, and that's how we use it to influence mass movement of civilians or refugees in either a conflict or disaster zone. We very quickly get into very muddy waters, though, when you start comparing media ops and psyops and all those sorts of things. The other one, though, is from, so I've spent most of my civilian career in the sales world, setting up sales academies, especially in the automotive industry. And we really preach the mantra of anti-hype. Because it's all, at that stage, it is all about managing customers' expectations. So very recent example, a fairly large German car manufacturer, other car manufacturers are available, overstated, shall we say, their emissions levels. But it's not, and yes, we can have the fines and all the rest of it, but you mentioned in your presentation very early on about how we can really damage trust. And so from a hype point of view, it's perhaps part of a larger problem, because in every university in UK we teach marketing, but not a single one teaches sales. Different in the States. And so the more hype gets this sort of mythos, and I'm really worried about you telling people that it can be a good thing. I know that, but I don't want everyone else knowing it. When that gets embedded in the marketing teams, it's our poor sales folks, it's our poor customer facing staff in every business, as our entrepreneurial businesses get bigger and bigger and bigger and employ customer relations teams, they're going to have to deal with that hype. So I don't know if that was a question or a comment, but
no, that's fine. I've got a few things written down. So Abdullah, did you want to get everybody's and then I'll respond? Okay, cool.
Status.
Yes. Hi, Gemma. That was very interesting. I have one question, but first I want to invite you again in 4 years, because the research question of your PhD is very interesting, and I think that you will find in this department we have quite strong views about the role of futurists in making the future. So with a very strong foresight team and scenario planning, I think that we will be very interesting to compare notes in 3-4 years.
Oh, I would love to hook up sooner than that, for sure. So, that would be ace.
But in terms of
to hear from them.
What I wanted to ask, and I mean, I've never thought about hype in my life, but is hype for you an intended or unintended result? Because people try to create hype. Sometimes they do it intentionally. Sometimes hype it comes out because of the spin and so on. So do you think hype is an intended or unintended result? So that's my question. And thank you for your presentation.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Statis. There are two questions in the chat. So the first one is, so how would you potentially see using hype as a tool for noble causes like fighting against climate change? How exactly could it be employed in this context? So this is one question. The second one is, I'm curious about how much of the hype might be about the product and technology, the market, as against, say, the team or individual entrepreneurs. Are there personal part of the hype? So that's another question. So I have a question myself as well. So I just wonder, Gemma, I think you outlined the kind of a difference between hype and overhype, and you don't condemn hype if it is responsibly done. So I'm just wondering, if you look at the systems level, what is, because we know hype is a kind of creates a positive feedback loop as well. If you do hype, other people hypes about it as well, and it gets spiraled out of control at some point. How can this hype concept is relevant to policymaking? And especially in relation to, for instance, 5 great technologies, if you remember David Flett's kind of thing, which created the hype itself on quantum technologies and which contributed. It was needed somehow to divert attention to this, but it got out of control somehow as well, as you have one of the cases on quantum technologies. So how can policymakers be aware of the concept of hype, and how can they use hype? Because some of it is required and more of it is not required.
Awesome. Okay, cool. I think I've got those questions. So actually 3 of you, Abdullah, your question, I think also Slavomir, I'm really sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly in the chat. And also David, you also touched on this kind of like hype for good. So like David, when you were talking about movement, for instance, climate change is one in the chat, and then Abdullah, arguably policy as well. So this is something I was thinking about a lot with coronavirus. It's like, could we use hype to try and get people to stay at home? Or could we use hype for public health messaging or climate change or whatever that is? And I think it's a similar sort of, if you're talking about it from a sort of, is it doable perspective, it's a similar kind of conversation around what happens with like behavioral economics, nudge theory being used for these kind of, particularly it's used a lot in public health, trying to get people to stop smoking or eat healthier. And I think though there's still a lot of discussion, particularly with behavioral economics, but also around usage of hype, around ethically, what does that really look like? So if I don't know how much people have come across the kind of corporatization of behavioral economics. When I was at Ogilvy, they had a team in Ogilvy called Ogilvy Change, and it was a behavioral economics unit within an advertising company. And their job titles were choice architects. That was literally the job title of the people who worked in that department. I think it still is. And that's fun and interesting, whatever. But I mean, God, architecting people's choice, that doesn't sound right? If you really think about what that's about. But then, of course, when you're thinking about any kind of marketing strategy, sales strategy, whatever, you're trying to get people to respond in a particular way. So I think that, yes, hype can be used for good if you understand the tool and you understand how to use it. But again, it just comes back to what is the sort of, what's the downside of you doing it? What potentially could go wrong? And that's when we start having conversations around trust, around decontextualizing of the message, around exploding in such a way that has people believing the wrong thing, not being able to contend with it, not, making it overly simplistic that it leaves out some really, important points. So I think it's about balancing the cost of a particular message, which, really we should be doing with many different kinds of messaging, with the potential upside of it. And, I'm personally I'm similar to what you were saying, David. I'm not here to advocate that hype is a good thing. It's more that increasingly I see hype being spoken about as a tactic of particularly entrepreneurs. Like VCs tell entrepreneurs to hype themselves. That's literally what they're telling them to do. And I'm going, what? No, we need to stop promoting this idea. But instead, if we're going to talk about this idea of you need to hype yourself in order to, something to happen, then let's at least talk about how to do it responsibly. I'm not saying everybody should start using this as a strategy as such. In terms of how it looks actually, perhaps in context, as Slavomir's asked in terms of climate change, it's a really difficult one, because with climate change, I think in some sense, the sort of systems journalism around climate change has been what's been going on with the coverage of it, but in some ways the sort of hunger for a systems approach to it has been more recent, and so it's unfortunately had the effect of feeling like it's muddying the waters. And this is where when you talk about promoting critical thinking, you have to also say, but don't not believe anything. There's a difference between being skeptical and asking questions and wanting to know more versus assuming that everything you read is incorrect. So I think that in some ways you could have had these more absolutist narratives used with climate change earlier on, but instead, arguably, there's been a lot more. It's been very responsible in many ways, and it's then had to contend with falsities. What I hope is that nowadays, because the same sort of approach to talking about climate change is systems and is nuanced, in a situation where there is more hunger for that, maybe that's a good thing. I don't think if we suddenly started being hypey and absolutist and whatnot around climate change ideas, you're necessarily going to do a good thing nowadays because of the switch in how people receive these hypey ideas. Unfortunately, that's kind of my take on, I suppose, climate change. Some of the other things that came up, so this idea of intended versus unintended results that Status was talking about. So you definitely hear people talking about how to create hype. I mean, that's something you hear a lot about in advertising firms. That's something that was talked about loads at Ogilvy. It was like, how do you create momentum around ideas, and how do you get people to share, and so on and so forth. I think that it is doable with resource, as many things are. It can also happen by accident. I think where I think it's important to talk about this intention is, again, if you are intending for a message to be widely spread, it's thinking about what is it that you're actually saying, and what's the cost of that spread? What happens if it spirals out of control, shall we say? What does that mean? And therefore, how can you change what you do in order for, if there is a amplification of your message, what happens? When it's unintended, I don't think you can sort of say, oh, everyone's off the hook because they didn't mean for it to happen. I think if you're a business or anyone, if you're deliberately putting out a message, you should be thinking about what that message is. It's not really enough to say, oh, we didn't mean for it to explode. You still put a message out into the world in the hope that people would read it and care about it, and so on and so forth. So, but I think this sort of manufacturing of hype is absolutely doable with resource. I mean, that is what the marketing and sales industry, more marketing, David, is definitely there for. But again, it's coming back to that: why are you doing it? How are you doing it? Do you really need to do it? What kind of attention do you actually require for what it is that you're doing? And what are you unseating or whatever? What ideas are you pushing out the way for yours to kind of get through? And is that fair play? Sarah's point about people versus products and market. No, I don't think that it's not about people. I mean, I think there certainly can be a lot of hype around individuals. I mean, again, this is another thing that I was struggling with how entrepreneurs are being told to market themselves, find your interesting story. What's your interesting background? What's your, whatever. And, some people don't have that, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that their product's rubbish because they didn't, come from a particular country or a background, or had the idea when they were 5 years old, or whatever it is that we're trying to push on them. Again, though, it's a different kind of story. And what's the intention of telling it? So if you want Wired to write about you as an entrepreneur and your amazing story, fine. That doesn't necessarily help your product. That makes you an interesting person, right? So I think, again, it comes back to the intention behind the story that you're telling. If the person who's at the forefront is critical to the message that you're putting out, then of course that's where that persona is going to be hyped up. But I would argue that a lot of the time, if you're talking about it from a business perspective, you don't need the person to be a figurehead as such. And in fact, that's also where I think you end up having those issues with nobody's perfect. And so if you put out a message that this person's amazing, it's very easy for someone to find something about them that isn't, and for that to come crashing down very quickly. Very similar to what David was saying about if you hype up your emissions and then it's found out later that you've overhyped, that's not going to look good. So I think it's about that sort of working out why you're even bothering to say something in the first place. Well, I guess, Abdullah, your point about hype and policymaking, I think, ties back to this point of like hype for good. But really, I guess I just keep going back to like what is good, right? And that's everybody has a different perception of like what is worthy of, if the cost of putting a message out is that it could be misunderstood and it could spread in a particular way, what makes it worth it? If we have to use hype, what makes it worth it? And people have different, reactions to that. I did a talk at London Futurists, and a lot of the audience were pretty adamant that it was absolutely fine that Elon Musk hypes whatever he likes because he's this amazing person that does brilliant things. Whereas I was, did not agree. But again, that's a sort of normative assessment of, your own personal opinions about what you think about hype. I've just seen there's a message gone in, so I'm just really going to quickly. It's just people saying thanks or that they need to leave. That's nice. You're welcome. Yeah. Bye-bye. That's cool. Hopefully that touches on some of the points you guys were bringing up. Happy to expand if need be.
Thanks very much, Gemma. I think it was really fascinating, mind-blowing talk. And you were the only person that I have seen this year who hasn't used the slide presentation. But it went really very well. I really like it. That is something that we can learn as well.
Not at all. I mean, it's pros and cons. I think I just... I like to just talk with people when we're not physically there. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to beaming a screen across the ether to some degree. Thank you, Lucrezia. That's a really nice thing to say. I can just talk, Scottish people, most of you will know this. We can just talk for days,
I think we all need some interaction. So having you look at us in the face while you're talking makes a big difference. So
I appreciate that.
We're all able to engage much better because of that. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Well, as I said, I don't know how many of you were on I don't think you were on the call when I said I'm actually moving to Glasgow next week from London. So once we're all able to physically be in places, I'm based at UCL, but being remote, I would love to kind of interact with the universities up in Scotland. So hopefully we can do some fun stuff together. I'm going to take you up status on your point about all your foresight expertise, because I'll need to tap into that for my PhD.
I think, Gemma, with that positive note, I'm sure once we return to normal, there will be a lot of people from the department who will invite you for coffee.
That would be brilliant.
Thank you very much. It was really very interesting presentation for us. And let's keep in touch. And thanks, everybody, for their questions and contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.